From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome to all of you to the National Book Festival. I'm Rob Casper, the head of the Poetry and Literature Center at the Library of Congress. We are home to the Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry. Our new Poet Laureate, Juan Felipe Herrera, he is here at the book festival. We also put on 30 to 40 events annually. Most of them are at the library. If you are from DC and you are looking for more events like this, check out our calendar, www.loc.gov/poetry. Before we begin, I just want to let you know that there might be a Q&A session for today's event, and there are microphones at either side of the front here if you want to ask a question and Phil Klay asks you to. Come on up and do so at one of these two mics. Note, though, that this event is being recorded for webcast, and if you do ask a question, you will be recorded and live at the Library of Congress online forever, which is not a bad thing to say about yourself. It is a great honor to introduce Phil Klay. I should say that this is one of those introductions I was excited to get the opportunity to do. I lobbied for it, and I only get to say a very little bit, and I'll say my little bit, but I could spend 5 or 10 or 15 minutes talking about how great this book is. So I'm probably as excited as you are to hear him read. Klay is the author of the short story collection Redeployment, which received the 2014 National Book Award. That year, the National Book Foundation also named him a 5 under 35 honoree, which makes him the only writer to be simultaneously honored by that foundation, both for his potential and for his achievement. The kind of thing that can go to the head of a lesser human. The citation for the award states, quote, "If all wars ultimately find their own Homer, this brutal, piercing, sometimes darkly funny collection stakes Klay's claim for consideration as a quintessential storyteller of America's Iraq conflict." I wholeheartedly concur and also believe that with their commitment to detail, unflinching focus and vision, and ability to portray the minds and hearts of so many Americans taking part in our country's current conflict, Klay's stories cannot but change us. Please join me in welcoming Phil Klay.
Thank you. That was wonderful. My Lord, this is a little overwhelming. Surrounded by so many readers. I'll start with the first story, called Redeployment. We shot dogs. Not by accident. We did it on purpose, and we called it Operation Scooby. I'm a dog person, so I thought about that a lot. First time was instinct. I hear O'Leary go, "Jesus," and there's a skinny brown dog lapping up blood the same way he'd lap up water from a bowl. It wasn't American blood, but still, there's that dog lapping it up. And that's the last straw, I guess, and then it's open season on dogs. At the time, you don't think about it. You're thinking about who's in that house, what's he armed with, how he's going to kill you or your buddies. You're going block by block, fighting with rifles good to 550 meters, and you're killing people at 5 in a concrete box. The thinking comes later, when they give you the time. See, it's not a straight shot back from war to the Jacksonville Mall. When our deployment was up, they put us on TQ, this logistics base out in the desert, let us decompress a bit. I'm not sure what they meant by that, decompress. We took it to mean jerk off a lot in the showers, smoke a lot of cigarettes and play a lot of cards. And then they took us to Kuwait and put us on a commercial airliner to go home. So there you are. You've been in a no-shit war zone, and then you're sitting in a plush chair looking up at a little nozzle shooting air conditioning thinking, what the fuck? You've got a rifle between your knees, and so does everyone else. Some Marines got M9 pistols, but they take away your bayonets because you aren't allowed to have knives on an airplane. Even though you've showered, y'all look grimy and lean. Everybody's hollow-eyed and their camis are beat to shit. And you sit there and you close your eyes and you think. Problem is, your thoughts don't come out in any kind of straight order. You don't think, oh, I did A, then B, then C, then D. You try to think about home, then you're in the torture house. You see the body parts in a locker and the retarded guy in a cage. He squawked like a chicken. His head was shrunk down to a coconut. It takes you a while to remember Doc saying they'd injected mercury into his skull. You see the things you saw, the times you nearly died. The broken television and the Haji corpse, Eichholz covered in blood, the lieutenant on the radio. You see the little girl, the photographs Curtis found in a desk. First had a beautiful Iraqi kid, maybe 7 or 8 years old, in bare feet and a pretty white dress like its first communion. Next, she's in a red dress, high heels, heavy makeup. Next photo, same dress, but her face is smudged and she's holding a gun to her head. I tried to think of other things, like my wife, Cheryl. She's got pale skin and fine dark hairs on her arms. She's ashamed of them, but they're soft, delicate. But thinking of Cheryl, it made me feel guilty. And I think about Lance Corporal Hernandez, Corporal Smith, and Eichholz. We were like brothers, Eichholz and me. The two of us saved this Marine's life one time. A few weeks later, Eichholz is climbing over a wall, and Sergeant pops out a window when he's halfway over, shoots him in the back. So I'm thinking about that. And I'm seeing the retard and the girl and the wall Eichholz died on. But here's the thing. I'm thinking a lot, and I mean a lot, about those fucking dogs. So I'll move forward a little bit in that story. Thank you. So when you get in, you don't get off the plane and jump into the waiting arms of your family and they carry you off on their shoulders to a keg of beer. There's all this kind of administrative stuff that you have to do. And so they touch down and they're just dying to see their families, and they have to load all their stuff up on trucks, and then they get on buses. And the last thing that they do is go to the armory. So that's where they're at. When I got to the window and handed in my rifle, it brought me up short. It was the first time I'd been separated from it in months. I didn't know where to rest my hands. First I put them in my pockets, and then I took them out and crossed my arms, and then I just let them hang, useless, at my sides. After all the rifles were turned in, First Sergeant had us get in a parade formation with a fucking guidon out front, and we marched down A Street. When we got to the edge of the first barracks, people started cheering. I couldn't see them until we turned the corner, and then there they were, a big wall of people holding signs under a bunch of outdoor lights. And the lights were bright and pointed straight at us, so it was hard to look into the crowd and tell who was who. Off to the side, there were picnic tables and a Marine in Woodlands grilling hot dogs. And there was a bouncy castle. A fucking bouncy castle. We kept marching. A couple more Marines in Woodlands were holding the crowd back in a line, and we marched until we were straight alongside the crowd. And then First Sergeant called us to a halt. I saw some TV cameras. There were a lot of U.S. flags. The whole McManigan clan was up front, right in the middle, holding a banner that read, "Oorah, Private First Class Bradley McManigan, we are so proud." I scanned the crowd back and forth. I talked to Cheryl on the phone in Kuwait, not for very long, just, "Hey, I'm good, and yeah, within 48 hours, talk to the Fro. He'll tell you when to be there." And she said she'd be there, but it was strange on the phone. I hadn't heard her voice in a while. Then I saw Eichholz's dad. He had a sign too. It said, "Welcome back, heroes of Bravo Company." I looked right at him, and I remembered him from when we left, and I thought, that's Eichholz's dad. And that's when they released us, and they released the crowd too. I was standing still, and the Marines around me, Curtis and O'Leary and McManigan and Craig and Weissert, they were rushing out to the crowd, and the crowd was coming forward. Eichholz's dad was coming forward. He was shaking the hand of every Marine he passed. I don't think a lot of guys recognized him, and I knew I should say something, but I didn't. I backed off. I looked around for my wife, and I saw my name on a sign. Sergeant Price, it said, but the rest was blocked by the crowd, and I couldn't see who was holding it. And then I was moving toward it, away from Eichholz's dad, who was hugging Curtis, and I saw the rest of the sign. It said, Sergeant Price, now that you're home, you can do some chores. Here's your to-do list. Number 1, me. Number 2, repeat number 1. And there, holding the sign, was Cheryl. She was wearing cami shorts and a tank top, even though it was cold. She must have worn them for me. She was skinnier than I remembered, wore makeup too. I was nervous and tired, and she looked a bit different, but it was her. All around us were families and big smiles and worn-out Marines. I walked up to her, and she saw me, and her face lit. No woman had smiled at me like that in a long time. I moved in and kissed her. I figured that was what I was supposed to do. But it'd been too long, and we were both too nervous, and it felt like just lip on lip pressed together. I don't know. She pulled back and looked at me and put her hands on my shoulders and started to cry. She reached up and rubbed her eyes, and then she put her arms around me and pulled me into her. Her body was soft, and it fit into mine. All deployment, I'd slept on the ground or on canvas cots. I'd worn body armor and kept a rifle slung across my body. I hadn't felt anything like her in 7 months. It was almost like I'd forgotten how she felt, or never really known it. And now here was this new feeling that made everything else, black and white, fading before color. Then she let me go, and I took her by the hand, and we got my gear and got out of there. So, thank you. The book is 12 short stories, and they're all told by different narrators, doing different jobs. There's an infantryman, artilleryman, a chaplain, a foreign service officer. I'll read just the beginning of a story called Bodies, which is told by a mortuary affairs specialist, the Marines responsible for processing the remains of the dead. For a long time, I was angry. I didn't want to talk about Iraq, so I wouldn't tell anybody I'd been. And if people knew, if they pressed, I'd tell them lies. There was this Haji corpse, I'd say, lying in the sun. It'd been there for days. It was swollen with gases. The eyes were sockets, and we had to clean it off the streets. Then I'd look at my audience and size them up, see if they wanted me to keep going. You'd be surprised how many do. That's what I did, I'd say. I collected remains. U.S. forces, mostly, but sometimes Iraqis, even insurgents. There are 2 ways to tell the story: funny or sad. Guys like it funny, with lots of gore and a grin on your face when you get to the end. Girls like it sad, with a 1,000-yard stare out to the distance as you gaze on the horrors of war they can't quite see. Either way, it's the same story. This lieutenant colonel who's visiting the government center rolls up, sees 2 Marines maneuvering around a body bag, and decides he'll go show what a regular guy he is and help. As I tell the story, the lieutenant colonel's a large, arrogant bear of a man with fresh-pressed camis and a short, tight mustache. He's got huge hands, I'd say, and he comes up to us and he says, "Here, Marine, let me help you with that." And without waiting for us to respond or warn him off, he reaches down and he grabs the body bag. Then I'd describe how he launches up as though he's doing a clean and jerk, He was strong, I'll give him that, I'd say. But the bag rips on the edge of the truck's back gate, and the skin of the Haji tears with it a big jagged tear through the stomach. Rotting blood and fluid and organs slide out like groceries through the bottom of a wet paper bag. Human soup hits him right in the face, running down his mustache. If I'm telling the story sad, I can stop there. If I'm telling it funny, though, there's one more crucial bit, which Corporal G had done when he told the story to me for the first time, back in 2004, before either of us had collected remains or knew what we were talking about. I don't know where G heard the story. The colonel screamed like a bitch, G had said. And then he'd made a weird, high-pitched keening noise deep in his throat, like a wheezing dog. This was to show us precisely how bitches scream when covered in rotting human fluids. If you get the noise right, you get a laugh. What I liked about the story was that even if it happened, more or less, it was still total bullshit. After our deployment, there wasn't anybody, not even Corporal G, who talked about the remains that way. Some of the mortuary affairs Marines thought the spirits of the dead hung about the bodies. He'd creep them out. You could feel it, they'd say, especially when you look at the faces. But it got to be more than that. Midway through the deployment, guys started swearing they could feel spirits everywhere. Not just around the bodies, and not just Marine dead, Sunni dead, Shia dead, Kurd dead, Christian dead. All the dead of all Iraq. Even all the dead of all Iraqi history, the Akkadian Empire and the Mongols and the American invasion. I never felt any ghosts. Leave a body in the sun, the outer layer of skin detaches from the lower, and you feel it slide around in your hands. Leave a body in water, everything swells, and the skin feels waxy and thick, but it's recognizably human. That's all. Except for me and Corporal G, though. Everybody in mortuary affairs talked about ghosts. We never said any different. Thank you. So I'll read from one more story called 10 Clicks South, told by an artilleryman. So in Iraq, a lot of artillerymen did infantry-type missions, but some of them actually did artillery. They man these huge guns that can shoot targets very far away. And the guns would take, 9 men to operate, and they'd be on forward operating bases, generally. Forward operating bases were FOBs. They were these massive, very safe military bases, kind of little private cities with contractors and military personnel. There were some Marines who would go in and they'd only stay on the FOB, like they'd never go outside the wire. They were known as FOBits. This is set at Camp Fallujah, which is one of those FOBs. Some of them used to joke like, oh, they just flew us to Arizona and told us we were in Iraq. When I was in Iraq, some Marine recorded a song set to the tune of Hotel California, called Hotel Camp Fallujah. And the chorus went, welcome to the Hotel Camp Fallujah. You're in a combat zone. Go get your ice cream cone. Just, kind of give you the idea. I apologize for singing at you. All right, 10 Clicks South. This morning our gun dropped about 270 pounds of ICM on a smuggler's checkpoint 10 clicks south of us. We took out a group of insurgents and then we went to the Fallujah Chow Hall for lunch. I got fish and lima beans. I try to eat healthy. At the table, all 9 of us are smiling and laughing. I'm still jittery with nervous excitement over it. And I keep grinning and wringing my hands, twisting my wedding band about my finger. I'm sitting next to Vorstadt, our number 1 guy, and Jewett, who's on the ammo team with me and Bolander. Vorstadt's got a big plate of ravioli and Pop-Tarts. And before digging in, he looks up and down the table and says, "I can't believe we finally had an arty mission." Sanchez says, "It's about time we killed someone." And Sergeant Dietz laughs. Even I chuckle a little. We've been in Iraq 2 months, one of the few artillery units actually doing artillery. Except so far we've only shot illumination missions. The grunts usually don't want to risk the collateral damage. Some of the other guns in the battery had shot bad guys, but not us. Not until today. Today, the whole damn battery fired. Jewett, who's been pretty quiet, asks, "How many insurgents do you think we killed?" "Platoon-size element," says Sergeant Dietz. "What?" says Bolander. "Platoon-size sergeant? AQI don't have platoons." "Why do you think we needed the whole damn battery?" says Sergeant Dietz, grunting out the words. "We didn't," says Bolander. "Each gun only fired 2 rounds. I figured they just wanted us all to have gun time on an actual target. Besides, even 1 round of ICM would be enough to take out a platoon in open desert. No way we needed the whole battery, but it was fun." Sergeant Dietz shakes his head slowly, his heavy shoulders hunched over the table. "Platoon-size element," he says again. "That's what it was. And 2 rounds of gun was what we needed to take it out." "But," says Jewett in a small voice, "I didn't mean the whole battery. I meant our gun. How many did our gun, just our gun, kill?" "How am I supposed to know?" says Sergeant Dietz. "Platoon size is like 40, I say. Figure 6 guns, so divide, you got 6.6 people per gun?" "Yeah," says Bolander. "We killed exactly 6.6 people. Sanchez takes out a notebook and starts doing the math. "Divide it by 9 Marines on the gun, and you, personally, you've killed 0.7 something people today. That's like a torso and a head. Maybe a torso and a leg. That's not funny," says Jewett. "We definitely got more," says Sergeant Dietz. "We're the best shots in the battery." Bolander snorts. "We're just firing on the quadrant deflection the FDC gives us, Sergeant. I mean, we're better shots," says Sergeant Dietz. "Put a round down a rabbit hole at 18 miles. "But even if we were on target," says Jewett. "We were on target," says Dietz. "Okay, Sergeant, we were on target. But the other guns, their rounds could have hit first. Maybe everybody was already dead." "I can see that. The shrapnel thudding into shattered corpses, the force of it jerking the limbs this way and that." "Look," says Bolander, "even if their rounds hit first, doesn't mean everybody was dead necessarily. Maybe some insurgent had shrapnel in his chest, right? And he's like, "Ugh." Then our round comes down, boom, blows his fucking head off. He was dying already, but the cause of death would be blown the fuck up, not shrapnel to the chest." "Yeah, sure," says Jewett. "I guess. But I don't feel like I killed anybody. I think I'd know if I killed somebody." "Nah," says Sergeant Dietz. "You wouldn't know. Not until you'd seen the bodies." The table quiets for a second. Dietz shrugs. "It's better this way." "Doesn't it feel weird to you," says Jewett, "after our first real mission to just be eating lunch?" Sergeant Dietz scowls at him, then takes a big bite of his Salisbury steak and grins. "Gotta eat," he says, with his mouth full of food. "Feels good," Vorstadt says. "We just killed some bad guys." Sanchez gives a quick nod. "It is good." "I don't think I killed anybody," says Jewett. "Technically, I'm the one that pulled the lanyard," says Vorstadt. "I fired the thing you just loaded." "Like I couldn't pull a lanyard," says Jewett. "Yeah, but you didn't," says Vorstadt. "Drop it," says Dietz. "It's a crew-serve weapon. It takes a crew." "If we used a howitzer to kill somebody back in the States," I say, "I wonder what crime they'd charge us with." "Murder," says Sergeant Dietz. What are you, an idiot? Yeah, murder, sure, I say. But for each of us? I mean, in what degree? Me, Bolander, and Jewett loaded, right? If I loaded an M16 and handed it to Vorstadt and he shot somebody, I wouldn't say I'd killed anyone. It's a crew-served weapon, says Sergeant Dietz. Crew-served weapon. It's different. And I loaded, but we got the ammo from the ASP, I say. Shouldn't they be responsible too, the ASP Marines? Yeah, says Jewett. Why not the ASP? Why not the factory workers who made the ammo, says Sergeant Dietz, or the taxpayers who paid for it? You know why not? Because that's retarded. The lieutenant gave the order, I say. He'd get it in court, right? Oh, you believe that? You think officers would take the hit? Vorstadt laughs. How long have you been in the military? Sergeant Dietz thumps his fist on the table. Listen to me. We're Gun 6. We're responsible for that gun. We just killed some bad guys with our gun. All of us. And that's a good day's work. I still don't feel like I killed anybody, Sergeant, says Jewett. Sergeant Dietz lets out a long breath. It's quiet for a second. Then he shakes his head and starts laughing. Yeah, well, all of us except you, he says. Thank you. So, thank you. If anyone has any questions, I would be very happy to answer them. So I guess there are microphones here and there.
Hi. First of all, I really loved your book.
Thank you.
And also, I wanted to ask you when you started composing these stories. So was it that you were taking notes during deployment, like while you were in Iraq, or did you sort of decide a couple months later, like, I could write a book?
I mean, I always wrote, right? So I always, when I was a kid, I wrote, and was always a big reader, though I'd never written anything really that had to do with war. I started writing the book itself when I came home a couple months after I got back from Iraq. And actually the first story in the book, Redeployment, is the first story that I wrote. The first line is the first line I wrote. And I guess what it was, for me, writing is always the best way that I know how to think something through, right? Because, you have these ideas about the world, and then when you put them on paper, it exposes everything that you don't actually know, right? And you go back and try and make it more real, more alive. Characters, the characters start just destroying everything you thought you understood about an experience. And I certainly came back from Iraq with a lot of questions, right? I think everybody, you come back and, all right, what was that? Not just necessarily what I experienced, but, what people that I knew had gone through, what coming back felt like and what it meant, right? America looks, I think, very different when you come back. And so there was a part of it that was just trying to, ask these questions and explore these things that troubled me. The other thing was I came back and it felt like, we're doing this huge thing as a country, right? The stakes are incredibly high. But it didn't feel to me like there was a lot of engagement with our military policy and the experiences of veterans and what that meant. And so I very much wanted to write something to actually reach out and communicate with people, right? And I guess that's those two things were what compelled me to work on the book and try and explore different facets of the experience that either troubled me or that I thought I wanted to be in conversation with people about.
Earlier today, we heard from Marilyn Robinson, whose novels explore human experience from the perspective of people of faith. And in an interview with NPR earlier this year or last year, you were asked specifically in regard to the chaplain's story.
Sure.
About faith in your fiction, and you mentioned your Jesuit education background. How is in your fiction, the experience of war and the perspective different from the lens of the chaplain? Or can you talk about faith and
How is my perspective different from the chaplain?
or the experience of the person of faith?
Well, I don't know. I mean, faith and religious literature is one of the tools that I use to try and understand not just war, but other aspects of human experience, right? I mean, a lot of my great loves in terms of literature are writers like Shusaku Endo or Flannery O'Connor, Graham Greene. And Georges Bernanos, Diary of a Country Priest, was very important for me while I was writing that story. And I think one of the things that maybe that was important to me was, you know, when those novelists are looking at human experience, when Bernanos is looking at the life of a country priest, the stakes for that character in their interactions, even though they're not at war, people aren't dying, are so incredibly high, right? Because he believes in sin and redemption. And it's that moral and spiritual component that electrifies that work, and provides a way to understand just human interaction, the way that people behave towards each other. And so for, you know, in a strange way, even though my story is set in a war zone, the questions about suffering, about the cruelty that people are willing to inflict on one another, about the possibility of real and meaningful connection between human beings, they're the same questions, even though the situation is very different. I don't know if that answers your question. But
Hi. I have read the book, and it was a wonderful, I can't say, maybe that's the wrong word, an illuminating experience.
Thank you.
And so when I think about this book in the context of other novels about war, for instance, Dispatches,
Yeah.
the things they carried, Chris Hedges' book, Wars, a Force That Gives Us Meaning, I'm wondering where you place this book. I mean, it seemed to have a different voice. Is there a voice that's unique to the Iraq War, and does it relate to the futility of the Iraq War, many people would say? And how does that compare with the other books? And also Chris Hedges' theory about war being an intoxicating, addictive experience.
Well, I mean, you know, it seems like every war shares common components, and then every war is very distinct, right? You know, there's a reason we keep reading the Iliad, and it feels relevant in every age. But at the same time, we need new war stories, unfortunately, with every age as well. I mean, I don't know, you know, necessarily where to place my book in terms of other literature, but these wars are very different. Iraq's very different. Iraq's very different from Afghanistan. And
How would you differentiate them?
I mean, well, so where somebody was, or even to put it at a more granular level, Iraq is very different depending on when you were there. So I have two friends named Matt. They were both scout cavalry guys. They both served in the same region of Iraq. They both worked with the same Iraqi translator, a guy who loved rap music and was nicknamed Suge Knight by the troops. And yet, you know, one of those Matts was there in 2006, and one of them was there in 2008, and their stories are nothing alike, right? And if that's true for the two Matts, like, you know, how true is that going to be for a chaplain in Ramadi versus somebody doing reconstruction in another province? And the other thing about these wars that I think is very distinct and very important is they're fought by such a small percentage of the country, right? It's an all-volunteer force. And so, an all-volunteer force that keeps going over. So, when I joined the military, I took my oath of office in 2005. We had already been in Iraq and Afghanistan for years. I left the military in 2009, and then friends of mine, people I knew, kept going over, right? And yet, I live in the Northeast. Every once in a while, I'd find somebody who would tell me that I was the first veteran of Iraq or Afghanistan that they knew. And so I think that creates a lot of complicated challenges, right? Because part of the experience of war is the experience of coming home and the community that you return to and their relationship to war. And so I think that's probably part of the reason why so many of the stories are about coming home or they take place at the home front. Yeah. All right.
Your stories had a lot of emotional impact. And I've got two questions. One, I really enjoyed the last couple of sentences of every story.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of style, it looks like you tried to capture the emotional impact of the whole story in the last couple of lines of the book, and whether you were trying to do that, and whether that was hard to do. And the other question was, a number of the stories, the soldiers would get upset at the way people listened to their stories,
Mm-hmm.
or their reactions to their stories. And that showed up in about 3 or 4 different stories. So I wanted to know what your experience was when you came back and told stories, and were you also upset at how people reacted to your stories? Mostly in bars in your stories here.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the comment about the ending of the stories. Yeah, I mean, endings are very important to me. I probably wrote every story in this collection about 15, 20 times. I shared them with a lot of friends and got a lot of feedback, and trying to find a way out of the story that seemed to do justice to what the characters were feeling, but didn't close it off in some way, was something I usually tried to achieve. As far as coming back and telling stories, I mean, I already talked about sort of the conversation about war, or the sort of things that I felt were missing in the conversation about war that compelled me to want to write this. You don't just kind of go to war and come back, and you go to war with all the stories about war that you have in your head. You try and make sense of them, sense of what you're experiencing, using what you know while you're over there. And then you come back to all the stories about war and about veterans that we're telling ourselves. And sometimes that can be a really strange and disorienting thing. It's changed. When I joined the military, a lot of times the sort of reaction that I would get was like, oh, you must be a badass. You ever shoot those guns that fire very far away, and those sorts of things. And I was a POG. I was a public affairs officer. I was like not a tough guy Marine. When I was on field exercises, I used to memorize poetry to stave off the boredom. And then, like, at a certain point, I realized that, and I realized it had happened a lot. Like, I met a lot of people who would assume that I was psychologically damaged, right? And not, I met a guy in a bar, naturally, who told me that all Iraq veterans are going to snap after 10 years. And I'd been back for 3 at that point, so I had 7 left. He didn't say it in a mean way. He just wanted me to know this information. And yeah, so that was peculiar, especially when you'd get it. Like, there are a lot of reasons for somebody to come back and feel disconnected or alienated or frankly really angry about the way that things are going in terms of military policy in the country that have nothing to do with trauma. and everything to do with the kind of sense of moral stakes at play. There's a bit in Karl Marlantes' book, What It's Like to Go to War, where he says, ask the 20-year-old veteran at the gas station what it feels like to kill a man, and his probable angry answer, if he's being honest, is it doesn't feel like a fucking thing. But, he says, if you ask that same veteran that same question 40 years later, you might get a very different response. And it won't just be a different response based on who that person is or what they experience. It'll also be based on the community around them. And that community is going to be shaped by our stories about and understandings of war. And so, you know, my experience coming back and telling stories, I mean, some people are pissed off, right? And there's not necessarily a right reaction, right? One of the characters in the book tells a civilian, like, I reserve the right to be mad at you no matter what you say. Some people get frustrated because they're trying to navigate all the kind of cultural garbage that we have about war. You know, they're trying to navigate past that so they can actually have a real communication with another human being. And yeah, it's just a strange process. So I encountered all of the above. I encountered people who were great and listened to my ideas about war and told me when I was being an idiot. Because, you know, just because you one overseas doesn't mean you have any idea what your experience means, right? Like, that takes time to figure out, and it takes smart, interested people. I mean, it doesn't have to be about war. This is why, if you're in a bad relationship, you go to your wise friend and complain about your significant other, and then they're like, okay, but you're also being a jerk, right? So I've had people who not just listened to the things that I wanted to talk about, but also challenged me, which is very important. And then I'd also have sort of weird interactions on, you know, different levels where somebody really wanted to interpret my experience in a political way, or they'd want me to tell them something that fit into a particular narrative that they liked believing. And so I try to get that across in the book.
Thank you. You wrote a great book.
Thank you.
A real classic book. I'm a former Marine from an earlier war.
Semper Fi.
So Semper Fi, I was going to say that. You took the words out of my mouth. The biggest fraternity in the world, right? Here's my question. Someone once said, I don't know who it was, that war is a bitch goddess that seduces young men who have not yet felt her savage embrace. That was true for me. Was it true for you?
Well, I'll say this. I was certainly much more naive when I joined. Yeah, I mean, I don't think it would be impossible to know what you were signing up for at the time. I didn't even know. I mean, you know, one of the things about it is there's the way that I understood what I'd been a part of when we came back from Iraq. I came back in 2008. Violence had radically declined. A lot of us left feeling very, very good about the situation on the ground. And then there's the sort of rethinking that I think a lot of veterans have done when we look at what's happening over in Iraq right now, right? And so, yeah, I was certainly much more naive about war when I joined, and I think it's hard to know. I mean, it's hard to prepare people for what they're going to experience in something intense. You just hope you have good people to do it.
I think the bitch goddess got you too.
All right, maybe one more question.
When I read Redeployment, I too was struck by the story about the chaplain prayer in the furnace and the commonality between religious leaders and members of the military as people for whom the normal rules of morality are changed or suspended, and who are expected to serve as agents of the forces of good. Earlier today, in Marilyn Robinson's talk, she remarked that there's a disconnect between the portrayal of religious leaders in American literature and a tendency to denigrate them or mock them, where even though in public life there are many beloved religious leaders. And so I'm wondering if you could speak about the tendency to revere or denigrate members of the military in American literature versus public life more generally.
Right. I mean, I think that it was James Fallows wrote that, the American public is willing to do anything for the military to take them seriously, right? That there's maybe a bit too tart, but when I think about the military war policy, what I don't want somebody to tell me that I'm the greatest thing in the world and that everything that I did was great. I don't want somebody, to just assume that everything that I did was totally evil. People in the military were doing a mission. They were trying to achieve a better outcome, right? A lot of them are invested in that, right, rather than in being sort of patted on the head or excoriated. And so, for me, oftentimes I'll have disagreements with somebody with policy or what I think is the best way forward. But I often find that the commonalities that I have, I'll feel more commonality with somebody who I disagree with vehemently, but I feel like is very honestly engaged at a granular level in what war is and where we should go forward and in the kind of moral stakes of whatever policy it is, than somebody who thinks I'm the greatest person in the world, but doesn't care about that. And, so, yeah, I suppose, the sort of vets sometimes talk about like the image of the vet as a hero or the image of the vet as a victim, but we're people who did a job, and that job for the most part mattered to us a lot in its specifics. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.